The warm, honeyed light of 1,000 crystal pendants cascaded down upon the opulent dining room of Elysian, a restaurant that was less an eatery and more a monument to success. Nestled in the most affluent corner of the city, its name was a whisper on the lips of socialites and a benchmark for the aspiring. Tonight, like every night, was a parade of quiet extravagance. Sleek, foreign sports cars purred at the curb, their polished hoods reflecting the city's glittering skyline. Men in bespoke suits and women draped in silks and jewels drifted through the heavy glass doors, their laughter mingling with the soft, melancholic notes of a lone cello playing in the corner. The air itself seemed to hum with the energy of wealth and influence. Into this meticulously curated world of sophistication, a figure entered, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his attire. He was a giant of a man, his frame filling the grand entryway, yet he seemed to be actively trying to shrink himself, to become invisible. This was Giannis Antetokounmpo, a name that echoed like thunder in the arenas of the NBA, a two-time MVP, a champion. But here, in the hushed reverence of Elysian, he was just a man in a simple, heather gray hoodie, comfortable sweatpants, and a pair of well-loved basketball sneakers. His clothes were not a statement. They were a testament to a day spent in comfort, not in performance. A few heads turned near the entrance, a flicker of recognition, a whispered, "Is that?" But in the formal theater of Elysian, his presence was an anomaly, a disruption to the carefully composed scene. Most dismissed him, their eyes gliding over his casual form to seek out more familiar symbols of status. At the hostess stand, a young woman named Clara stood sentinel. Her uniform was immaculate, a crisp black dress that spoke of severe elegance. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, architectural bun, not a single strand daring to defy its perfect geometry. A practiced, professional smile was fixed on her lips, but it never reached her eyes. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, constantly assessing the worth of those who sought entry into her domain. Having worked at Elysian for 3 years, she had come to see herself not as a waitress, but as a gatekeeper of its prestige. Her pride in her position was immense, but it had curdled into a brittle arrogance, a tendency to render swift, merciless judgment based on appearances. When her gaze fell upon Giannis, it was like a physical blow. She took in his athletic wear, the relaxed slump of his shoulders, and her perfectly plucked eyebrows arched in a gesture of supreme disdain. Someone like him doesn't belong here. The thought was as sharp and clear as the chime of a crystal glass. In Clara's carefully ordered world, guests were expected to radiate a certain polish, a quiet confirmation of their right to be there. This man, she decided with chilling certainty, could not possibly afford a single glass of water from their menu, let alone a full meal. He was an error in the evening's equation. Giannis, seemingly oblivious to the waves of judgment emanating from the hostess stand, approached with a gentle, almost shy smile. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, warm rumble with the distinctive cadence of his Greek accent. "Good evening," he said, his eyes kind. "A table for one, please, if you have anything available." Clara's professional smile flickered, momentarily thrown by the politeness in his tone. But she recovered quickly, her superiority reasserting itself like a shield. With a condescending tilt of her head, she replied, her voice dripping with saccharine condescension, "Good evening, sir. This is a fine dining establishment. Are you certain you're in the right place?" The insinuation was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Giannis's smile did not waver. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze calm and unshakable. "Yes," he said simply. "I've heard great things. I would like to try the food." Clara let out a small, almost inaudible sigh of exasperation. She rolled her eyes just enough for the gesture to be felt, rather than seen. "Very well," she said, her tone suggesting she was indulging a toddler. "Let me see what we have. Please wait here." She turned, her back ramrod straight, her thoughts racing with a venomous glee. This will be fun. Let's see the look on his face when he sees the prices. He won't last 10 minutes. Giannis remained by the stand, his hands tucked into the pocket of his hoodie, He observed the room, his eyes taking in the golden light, the intricate dance of servers, the quiet confidence of the patrons. He had faced down the roar of 20,000 hostile fans, the crushing pressure of a championship game on the line. The petty snobbery of a waitress was a gentle breeze in comparison. His calm was not an act. It was a fortress built over years of struggle and triumph. He didn't say another word, but his quiet, towering presence began to pique the curiosity of those around him. That night, Giannis Antetokounmpo had walked into a world of glamour he seemingly did not belong to. Or rather, he was about to challenge the very foundations of prejudice upon which that world was built. Clara returned from her feigned search for a table, her expression one of barely concealed triumph. She had worked at Elysian long enough to consider herself the ultimate arbiter of class within its hallowed walls, and in her narrow worldview, Giannis was a glaring violation. "Are you absolutely sure you wish to dine with us tonight?" She pressed her voice, a cocktail of mockery and disdain. "As I said, this is a rather exquisite restaurant." Her gaze deliberately dropped to his worn sneakers, lingered there for a beat too long, then traveled back up to his face, a silent, insulting inventory. Giannis, who had been judged on courts and in headlines for years, simply offered a small, patient smile. He met her challenging gaze, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Yes, I would like to experience it." His voice was a low, calm counterpoint to her shrill sarcasm, rendering it almost irrelevant. But Clara was relentless. Tilting her head, a smirk playing on her lips, she was determined to crack his composure. With an exaggerated, almost theatrical grace, she gestured for him to follow. "This way then," she said over her shoulder. "I'll find a suitable place for you." She led him not to one of the many empty, well-appointed tables in the main dining area, but on a winding journey through the heart of the restaurant. They passed tables bathed in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, where patrons exuded sophistication, their conversations a lively, cultured hum. Clara glided past them all, her pace quickening as they moved further from the epicenter of elegance. Her path ended in the far corner of the room, a forgotten annex where the lighting was dimmer, the ambiance less refined, and the rhythmic clatter of dishes and shouted orders from the kitchen staff bled through the walls. Stopping at a small, isolated table that seemed almost like an afterthought, she turned with a brittle, forced smile. "This spot should be perfect for you," she announced, her voice loud enough for the adjacent tables to hear. She dropped the heavy, leather-bound menu onto the table with a dismissive thud. The sound was a punctuation mark on her insult. Giannis showed no reaction. He simply nodded, his smile still intact, his eyes as calm as a deep lake. He pulled out the chair and sat, his large frame settling into the cramped space. It was as if nothing in his environment could disturb the profound peace he carried within him. Clara, however, had expected a reaction, a complaint, a flash of anger, a moment of embarrassment, anything to validate her judgment. His serene indifference was infuriating. Frustrated, she turned to walk away, but couldn't resist one last parting shot delivered to the air but aimed directly at him. "I do hope you enjoy the ambiance back here. Not everyone gets such a prime location." The patrons at the nearest tables, who had been watching the exchange, began to murmur. A young woman, Lisa, dining with a companion, shook her head in disbelief. "That was unbelievably rude," she whispered. "He didn't do a single thing to deserve that." Further away, at a central table under the softest part of the chandelier's glow, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, observed the unfolding drama. Mr. Harrison, a distinguished man with a mane of silver hair and eyes that had seen decades of business deals, took a slow sip of his wine. "He's remarkably composed," he murmured to his wife. "Most men would have made a scene by now." Back at the hostess stand, Clara allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. In her mind, she had successfully quarantined the problem, relegated the outlier to a place where he wouldn't tarnish the restaurant's image. Yet, even as she savored her perceived victory, a subtle, invisible disquiet began to ripple through the room. Though he had said little, Giannis's presence was a powerful force. It wasn't just his imposing height, but the unshakable dignity he projected. That night, Elysian was on the verge of becoming more than just an upscale restaurant. It was about to become a classroom, and a difficult lesson was about to be taught. Clara stood a few paces from Giannis's table, her eyes scanning the scene as if she were a general plotting her next move. Her previous gambits, the condescending questions, the demeaning seating arrangement had failed to elicit the desired response. His placid demeanor was a personal affront to her sense of order. She felt a burning need to escalate, to force a crack in his serene facade. Retrieving a menu, she approached his table again, her steps slow and deliberate, designed to draw the attention of the surrounding diners. Placing the menu before him, she leaned in, her posture a caricature of helpfulness, her tone dripping with mock concern. "The menu can be a bit overwhelming," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Would you like me to perhaps explain the pricing for you?" Her finger, with its perfectly manicured nail, tapped pointedly at the most extravagant item listed, the Poseidon's Kiss, a lavish seafood platter featuring rare oysters, imported caviar, and lobster, priced at an eye-watering $450. She enunciated the price with relish, her eyes locked on his, searching for the inevitable flicker of shock and panic. But Giannis, as solid and unmovable as a marble statue from his homeland, remained impassive. He simply looked up from the menu, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes. "That sounds wonderful," he said, his voice calm and even, as if he were ordering a simple side salad. "I'll have that, and a bottle of the Antetokounmpo from Santorini, please." His response was a bucket of ice water on her fiery condescension. She hesitated, her smug script momentarily forgotten. She had not anticipated this. Choosing the most expensive dish, and not only that, but ordering a specific high-end Greek wine with the casual confidence of a connoisseur, didn't fit her narrative. Recovering quickly, she let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound brittle with disbelief. "Oh, really?" she replied, her voice now syrupy sweet but laced with a new, sharper contempt. "An excellent choice. I do hope you can appreciate it. It's not the sort of thing most people are accustomed to." The nearby diners were now fully invested in the drama. The young couple at the next table exchanged wide-eyed glances. "She's just digging the hole deeper," the man whispered. "Why is she being so awful to him?" Clara, seemingly deaf to the shifting atmosphere, lingered at the table, one hand resting on the back of the empty chair, waiting for him to buckle. But Giannis just smiled. "Thank you for the recommendation," he said, his voice a model of politeness and tranquility. "I'm looking forward to it." His composed reply was a quiet checkmate that left Clara flustered. In her mind, this giant in sweatpants couldn't possibly comprehend the value of such a meal. He was posturing, faking it. Unknowingly, her relentless campaign of microaggressions had only served to expose her own profound lack of class and professionalism. As she finally turned to leave, she deliberately raised her voice, addressing her colleague Jake, who was polishing glasses behind the bar. "Table 9 wants the Poseidon's Kiss," she announced loud enough for half the room to hear. "He probably doesn't even know what half that stuff is. Some people just order the most expensive thing to look important. Just wait until the bill comes. I bet he makes a run for it." Jake, a young man with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression, flinched at her words. He glanced over at Giannis, who was now calmly unfolding his napkin, seemingly unbothered by the public commentary on his finances. "Clara, maybe just let it go," Jake murmured, his voice low. "He's a customer." "He's a joke," she hissed back, her face flushed with a mixture of frustration and righteous indignation. Though he was the subject of intense scrutiny, Giannis felt no embarrassment. He calmly perused the rest of the menu, his interest genuine, as if he were simply a man enjoying a rare evening out. From her post at the bar, Clara continued to watch him, a storm of irritation brewing behind her eyes. His refusal to be rattled was a direct challenge to her authority. But she also felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, believing she had successfully asserted her dominance over someone she deemed an intruder in her world. From his table, Mr. Harrison watched the entire exchange with a keen, analytical eye. He turned to his wife, a thoughtful frown on his face. "He's playing a different game entirely," he murmured. "He's not reacting because he doesn't have to. He's letting her unravel all on her own. It's quite fascinating." The atmosphere in the restaurant, once a symphony of refined elegance, was now discordant and tense. The air was thick with unspoken judgments and simmering resentments, a spark waiting for oxygen. And at the center of it all sat Giannis Antetokounmpo, calm and unshaken, seemingly just a man waiting for his dinner, but in reality, he was waiting for something much, much bigger. Something that neither Clara nor the entire restaurant could possibly anticipate. Convinced that her verbal jabs and condescending service were not having the desired effect, Clara decided on a new tactic: complete and utter neglect. In her twisted logic, if she treated him as if he were invisible, he would eventually internalize that feeling of worthlessness and leave. Turning her back on him, she launched into a performance of hyper-attentive service for the other tables. She stopped at a central table where a wealthy couple was celebrating an anniversary. Flashing a radiant 1,000-watt smile, she leaned in conspiratorially. "May I recommend another bottle of the Chateau Margaux? The 2015 vintage is drinking beautifully tonight and would pair exquisitely with your main courses." The couple, flattered by the attention, readily agreed. Clara lingered, making small talk, laughing at the husband's jokes, all while her eyes darted towards Giannis's corner, noting his continued, infuriating patience. She made a show of passing his table repeatedly, a tray balanced expertly in one hand, her focus always on a destination beyond him. The rhythmic, almost aggressive click-clack of her heels on the polished floor became a drumbeat of disrespect. Giannis, a man who had perfected the art of patience through endless drills and grueling physical therapy, remained completely composed. His large hands rested on the table, and his gaze drifted around the room, taking in the art on the walls, the flicker of candlelight, with a quiet, meditative curiosity. In the corner, the small jazz trio began a new set. A soulful, bluesy melody filled the space. When the song concluded, Giannis clapped, a warm, resonant sound that was genuine and appreciative. The musicians, accustomed to being treated as living wallpaper, looked over in surprise and smiled, offering him a collective nod. His simple act of acknowledgement did not go unnoticed by the other diners. It was a small gesture of class that stood in stark contrast to the treatment he was receiving. At the service station, Clara frowned, her mask of professional charm momentarily slipping. Giannis's composure was more than just irritating. It was beginning to feel like a deliberate strategy to undermine her. Why won't he just get angry? She fumed internally. Why doesn't he complain? Demand to see the manager? She bit her lip, a fresh wave of frustration washing over her. Determined to break him, she decided to delay his food. She intercepted the food runner coming from the kitchen. "I'll take that to table 12, she said, taking a different dish. "Table 9 can wait a few more minutes." She then approached a group that had just been seated and began an exhaustive, overly detailed explanation of the daily specials, drawing out the process, fully aware that every second she wasted was another second Giannis had to wait. At the Harrisons' table, Mrs. Harrison leaned toward her husband, her voice a low, indignant whisper. "Do you see that? She is deliberately making him wait. He's been here for nearly an hour, and he hasn't even received his appetizer." Mr. Harrison took a slow sip of his wine, his sharp eyes fixed on Clara's performance. "I see it," he replied. "But what's truly remarkable is that he doesn't seem bothered in the slightest. He's waiting, yes, but I don't think he's waiting for the food. I think he's waiting for the perfect moment." Giannis remained in his seat, his posture relaxed. He pulled out his phone, not to scroll mindlessly, but to look at a photo that made him smile, a picture of his children, their faces bright with laughter. For a moment, the giant of the NBA was just a father, finding a moment of quiet joy amidst the strange, cold environment. As Clara passed his table yet again, she deliberately turned her back to him and spoke loudly to Jake. "You know, some people just don't understand that places like this have standards. It's almost comical watching them try to fit in." Though the words weren't addressed to him directly, The intended target was unmistakable. Several diners looked over, their expressions a mixture of shock and disapproval, but no one had the courage to intervene. At her table, Lisa could no longer contain her anger. She set her wine glass down with a firm click. "She's a monster," she said to her companion. "I cannot believe this restaurant employs someone so openly hostile." Her friend nodded thoughtfully. "But look at him," he said, gesturing with his chin towards Giannis. "He doesn't need us to defend him. He knows exactly what he's doing." The prolonged wait had transformed from a service issue into a tense, silent standoff. Giannis's unwavering calm and quiet confidence had, paradoxically, made him the undeniable center of the room's attention. His composure was a mirror, reflecting the pettiness of Clara's behavior back at her, a truth she was still desperately trying to avoid. The very fabric of Elysian's elegant atmosphere was fraying, thread by thread, and the breaking point was fast approaching. The tension in Elysian had become a palpable entity, a silent guest at every table. It wasn't the product of a loud argument, but of the profound, unsettling quiet surrounding Giannis Antetokounmpo. He remained in his corner, a portrait of patience, while Clara continued her campaign of blatant neglect. Her unprofessionalism was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was the main event, and the audience was growing restless. At his central table, Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his voice low but laced with a cold anger. "This is beyond rude," he commented, his eyes locked on Clara as she laughed animatedly with another group of diners. "This is a disgrace to the establishment." Mrs. Harrison, who had been observing the situation with mounting distress, nodded in fervent agreement. Her face, usually a mask of polite society, was etched with clear discontent. "I have never, in all my years, seen a staff member behave with such malice," she said. "She is actively trying to humiliate that man. We must speak to the manager." Mr. Harrison placed his wineglass on the table, his expression firm and resolute. "You're right, my dear. An employee like that has no place here. But let's wait just a moment longer. I have a feeling this is about to resolve itself in a most dramatic fashion." In another corner of the restaurant, Lisa, the young businesswoman, could no longer remain a passive observer. She shook her head, her eyes flashing with indignation as she watched Clara. The blatant injustice of the situation had kindled a fire in her. "She's just awful," Lisa seethed to her companion. "How can a high-end restaurant possibly tolerate this kind of behavior from its staff?" Her companion, a thoughtful man who had been tracking the subtle shifts in the room, frowned. "Perhaps because he hasn't made a fuss, they think they can get away with it," he mused. "But I suspect he's waiting for the right moment to make his move." Lisa's gaze returned to Giannis, who sat upright, his expression serene, almost meditative. "He seems so confident," she said, a note of admiration in her voice. "But I hope the manager intervenes soon. It's just so fundamentally unfair to let this continue." At a nearby table, an elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, sat with her granddaughter, both of them having watched the entire spectacle unfold. She took a delicate sip of her tea and set the cup down with a quiet click. "This is shameful," she said, her voice soft but firm as steel. "The staff is here to provide service, not to pass judgment. That young woman is in desperate need of a lesson in humility." Her granddaughter, a young woman with bright, curious eyes, leaned forward. "But what do you think he'll do, Grandma? He's just sitting there, not saying a word." "His silence is his statement," Mrs. Gable replied with the wisdom of her years. "People who possess true self-worth have no need to announce it. He knows who he is. That girl, on the other hand, is about to find out who she is, and I suspect she won't like it." Meanwhile, Clara, blissfully unaware of the storm of disapproval gathering around her, remained committed to her petty agenda. She spent an inordinate amount of time at the more important tables, engaging in long, animated conversations, trying to create a gravitational center of attention away from the man in the corner. As she passed his table one more time, she didn't even glance in his direction, but spoke loudly to a fellow server. "This is precisely why we need to maintain certain standards. Not everyone understands the level of sophistication required here. Clearly, not everyone belongs. Giannis's gaze flickered towards her for a brief moment. He didn't need to respond. There was no victory to be won in a shouting match with someone so determined to misunderstand the world. Instead, he offered a discreet, almost imperceptible smile and continued to observe the room, where the murmurs of the other patrons were now becoming a low, steady buzz of shared indignation. At the central table, Mr. Harrison turned to his wife. "All right, that's enough. I'm going to find the manager. This isn't just unfair to that man, it's ruining the dining experience for everyone." Mrs. Harrison nodded, her eyes filled with empathy for the man in the corner. "I just hope he doesn't leave before this is resolved. He deserves an apology. He deserves respect." The silent, simmering tension in Elysian was no longer the hallmark of an exclusive restaurant. It had become a taut wire, stretched to its breaking point, waiting for a single touch to snap and unleash a confrontation. Clara, smug and self-satisfied, remained oblivious, convinced that the very patrons she was trying to impress were on her side. In reality, they had become a silent jury, and they had already reached their verdict. After what felt like an eternity, Clara finally approached Giannis's table. In her hands, she held a silver tray bearing the magnificent Poseidon's Kiss he had ordered. The platter was a work of art, a shimmering mosaic of oysters, caviar, and lobster, a dish that represented the pinnacle of the restaurant's culinary offerings. Clara moved with a theatrical slowness, her heels clicking a deliberate, arrogant rhythm on the floor. Her eyes betrayed a smug satisfaction, her every step a declaration that this service was being delivered under duress. As she reached the table, she paused, and with a flick of her wrists, she placed the platter down with just enough force to make the silverware clatter. The sound cut through the hushed room. Her smile was a cold, sharp thing. "Here is what you ordered," she announced, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I do hope you can manage to enjoy it." Giannis, as ever, remained the picture of polite composure. He looked from the elegantly presented dish to Clara's defiant face. "It looks incredible," he said, his voice warm and courteous, as if he hadn't heard the venom in her tone. "Thank you." Not content to leave it there, Clara leaned forward, a gesture that mixed feigned intimacy with pure intimidation. Her voice dropped to a low, conspiratorial hiss, yet it was sharp enough to carry. "This dish is for a refined palate. I take it this is your first time trying something like this, isn't it?" Giannis finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. There was no anger, no irritation, not even a hint of frustration. He simply smiled, a faint, knowing smile, and gave a slight nod. "Thank you for your concern." His calm, almost gentle response was more disarming than any angry outburst could have been. It didn't just disconcert Clara, it made the onlookers cringe with second-hand embarrassment for her. Instead of humiliating Giannis, she had only succeeded in holding up a mirror to her own pettiness. Lisa, at the nearby table, could no longer restrain herself. She leaned towards her friend, her voice a furious whisper. "He just thanked her." He politely thanked her, and she's still being sarcastic. It's unbelievable. Her friend nodded, his eyes fixed on Giannis's table. "She's trying to get a rise out of him, but I think she picked the wrong mountain to try and move." At the central table, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison watched with grim fascination. Mr. Harrison raised his wineglass, but didn't drink, his eyes tracking Clara's every move. "She has absolutely no idea who she is dealing with," he said, his voice low and firm. "A man with that kind of self-possession doesn't need to raise his voice. She's going to incinerate herself." Unaware of the silent judgments being passed all around her, Clara straightened up, feeling a surge of frustration. She scanned Giannis one last time, searching for any crack in his armor, any sign of discomfort, and found nothing. The feeling of defeat began to creep in, and to mask it, she fired one last arrogant salvo. "Well, if this doesn't suit your taste, we do have simpler options. Feel free to let me know." Giannis kept his smile steady and nodded again. "I'll keep that in mind. Thank you." His politeness was a wall she could not scale. With a frustrated sigh, Clara gripped her empty tray and spun on her heel, stalking away without a backward glance. At the service station, she slammed the silver tray down, startling Jake. "He's just pretending," she hissed, her voice tight with fury. "Pretending to be polite. I'm sure he doesn't even know what he's eating. People like him only come to places like this for attention." Jake looked at her with open disapproval. "Or maybe," he suggested quietly, "he just wants to have a peaceful dinner. Isn't that our job, to give it to him?" Clara rolled her eyes, her face a mask of disdain. "You don't get it, Jake. He doesn't belong. I'm telling you, the second that bill hits the table, he's gone." Meanwhile, Giannis began to eat. He savored the delicate, salty kiss of an oyster, the rich, buttery texture of the lobster. He ate slowly, deliberately, his expression one of genuine pleasure. Around him, the murmurs of the other diners grew, a rising tide of indignation on his behalf, and open disapproval of Clara. No one spoke aloud, but the collective energy in the room had shifted from formal elegance to an unsettling, judgmental tension. Sitting in his forgotten corner, Giannis Antetokounmpo had become the undisputed center of the universe. And he had done it by doing nothing at all, except calmly eating his meal, as if he were the one orchestrating the entire disastrous symphony. Clara, still basking in the glow of her perceived righteousness, had no idea that her petty actions were leading her not to a victory, but to a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Clara, still wearing her arrogant smirk, believed she had the situation firmly under control. She was certain her campaign of delays and insults would culminate in Giannis leaving, tail between his legs, humiliated and silent. What she failed to anticipate was the sudden, dramatic shift in the evening's power dynamic. From the front of the restaurant, a man emerged, moving with a quick, purposeful stride. This was Mr. Sterling, the general manager of Elysian, a man whose imposing presence and sharp suit radiated authority. His face was a mask of grave concern, and his eyes scanned the room until they landed on the corner table. His presence alone was enough to momentarily halt the low hum of conversation. He walked directly to Giannis's table, his pace urgent. The nearby patrons watched with undisguised curiosity. When he reached the table, he gave a slight, deferential bow, a gesture of profound respect. His voice, when he spoke, was low, but it carried through the now silent room. "Mr. Antetokounmpo," he said, the name dropping into the silence like a stone into a still pond. "It is an absolute honor to have you with us tonight. I am so terribly sorry for the delay in my welcome. I had no idea you were dining with us." The words detonated in the quiet room. The ambient murmur ceased entirely, replaced by a stunned, collective intake of breath. Patrons at nearby tables widened their eyes, forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Across the room, Clara froze mid-step, a tray of empty glasses clutched in her hand. Her mind snagged on the name. Antetokounmpo? Did he say Antetokounmpo? The thought spun in her head, a frantic, disbelieving spiral. Giannis, ever calm, placed his fork and knife down neatly. He looked up at Mr. Sterling and offered a warm, reassuring smile. "Please, no problem," he said, his gentle voice carrying the distinct lilt of his accent. "I was just hoping for a quiet dinner." Clara's world tilted on its axis. Her vacant eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding in the corner. She looked around the room and saw that every single eye was now focused on Giannis. To her horror, on her. A young man at a nearby table whispered to his date, his voice loud in the silence, "That's Giannis Antetokounmpo, the Greek freak. He's an NBA champion." His date added, her voice filled with awe, "And isn't he the one with that incredible life story? Came from nothing in Greece? He's a hero." The whispers spread like wildfire, a cascade of recognition and admiration. "He's a philanthropist. He's famous for being humble. How could the staff not recognize him?" Each comment was a fresh stab of humiliation for Clara. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A cold wave of panic and shame washed over her, so powerful it threatened to pull her under. She stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, her face draining of all color. Her hands trembled, the glasses on her tray rattling a frantic rhythm that echoed her own internal chaos. Mr. Sterling turned and cast a brief, sharp glance in her direction. His eyes were not angry, but they were heavy with a disappointment that was far worse. It was a gaze that saw everything, understood everything, and condemned everything. She felt stripped bare, her petty cruelty exposed for all to see. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The tension in the room was now thick enough to cut with a knife. At their table, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison exchanged a look of profound satisfaction. "I knew it, Mr. Kravitz," Harrison murmured. "His presence speaks for itself." He didn't have to say a single word. Lisa, at her table, shook her head slowly, her gaze fixed on the crumbling figure of the waitress. "She did this to herself," she whispered. "A person who treats others with such contempt has no place in the service industry." Giannis took a sip of water, then spoke softly to the manager. "You don't need to worry. It's fine. But perhaps I would like to have a conversation with your staff after my meal." Mr. Sterling nodded immediately, his expression shifting from concern to grim resolve. "Of course, Mr. Antetokounmpo. I will arrange it immediately." Clara felt the ground beneath her feet give way. Giannis's words, though spoken gently, carried the undeniable weight of command. All eyes were on her. Every glance was a silent indictment. The lesson she had intended to teach a man she deemed unworthy had boomeranged back with devastating force, becoming the most profound and public lesson of her own life. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had not only lost the trust of everyone in the room, but very likely her job as well. She stood frozen, engulfed by a fear of her own making, with absolutely nowhere to hide. Giannis looked directly at Clara, his gaze steady and penetrating. There was no anger in his eyes, but a deep, resonant seriousness that made her feel utterly exposed. He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm but quiet, yet it seemed to fill the entire room. "Miss," he began, not using her name, which was somehow more damning. "How do you believe a customer should be treated in your restaurant?" Clara opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. A strangled, incoherent sound escaped. I didn't know who you were," she finally stammered, the excuse sounding pathetic even to her own ears. Giannis shook his head slowly, a deep furrow forming between his brows. His voice remained low, but it sharpened with an undeniable authority. "You do not need to know who I am to show me respect," he said, each word landing with precision. "Every single person who walks through that door, whether they are wearing a suit or sweatpants, deserves to be treated with dignity. That is not a privilege. It is a basic human right." His words echoed in the silent room, a powerful sermon on decency that resonated far beyond the disgraced waitress. It was a lesson for everyone. Clara felt her knees weaken. She tried to form a response, to justify, to apologize, but her mind was a chaotic storm of shame. "Finally," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "but you are not like the other customers." Giannis leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. He spoke slowly, deliberately, allowing each word to sink in. "It is precisely because I am not like the other customers that you must learn to treat everyone the same. Respect is not a currency you distribute based on how people dress or what you assume is in their bank account. It is the foundation of everything. It is the most basic thing a person deserves." Clara lowered her head, her hands gripping the edge of her tray so tightly her knuckles were bone-white. She could not speak. She could not defend the indefensible. Every snide remark, every dismissive gesture, every moment of her cruel performance replayed in her memory, each one a fresh wave of mortification. From the central table, Mr. Harrison gave a subtle, approving nod. He whispered to his wife, "See? He doesn't need to shout. His character is his authority. What he says, and how he says it, is more powerful than any display of anger." Lisa, sitting nearby, raised her wine glass in a silent toast to Giannis. Her gaze rested on Clara, not with triumph, but with a kind of pity. "She will remember this night for the rest of her life," she murmured. "I just hope she truly learns from it." Mr. Sterling, who had remained a silent, grim observer, finally stepped forward. His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Clara, I think it's best if you go to the back. We will have a long talk after your shift. For now, let me handle this." Clara didn't respond. She simply nodded weakly, her eyes avoiding the dozens of gazes that followed her as she took a step back, then another, trying to retreat from the spotlight of her own making. Giannis watched her go for a moment, before turning his attention back to Mr. Sterling. His tone softened. "There is no need to make this a bigger problem than it has to be," he said. "I believe everyone can learn from their mistakes, as long as they are willing to change." His words were not just for the manager. They were for the entire room. Some patrons lowered their heads in quiet reflection, while others nodded in agreement, recognizing the profound truth in his statement. Giannis then picked up his knife and fork and calmly resumed his meal, as if nothing had happened. But everyone in the restaurant knew that his calm was not indifference. It was a lesson in grace, delivered with a weight and meaning that no one present would ever forget. From a distance, Clara could still feel the phantom weight of their eyes on her. Her actions that night would not be a footnote in her career. They would be a turning point, a harsh, painful, and necessary re-education in what it means to be a decent human being. When his plate was empty, Giannis gently wiped his mouth with his napkin, placed it on the table, and slowly rose to his full, towering height. A hush fell over the dining room. It felt as though time itself had paused. Every eye, from the diners at their tables to the servers hovering by their stations, was fixed on him. The only sounds were the distant, muffled clatter from the kitchen and the faint, nervous clinking of a wine glass. Giannis's gaze swept across the room. His face was calm, but his eyes held a profound seriousness that commanded absolute attention. When he finally spoke, his deep, resonant voice, with its rich Greek accent, carried a weight that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "This restaurant," he began, "was founded on a simple idea: to be a place that welcomes everyone, a place where the quality of the food is matched only by the quality of the welcome. This is the philosophy that the founders, myself included, have always believed in." He paused, his eyes moving from one face to another, ensuring his words were not just heard, but absorbed. The revelation that he was not just a patron, but an owner, sent a second, more powerful shockwave through the room. "Unfortunately," he continued, his voice tinged with a deep disappointment, "tonight, we failed to live up to that belief." The words landed like a judgment. The tension in the room thickened. Some diners lowered their heads, a flush of shame on their faces for having remained silent witnesses. Others nodded in solemn agreement, their own complacency now feeling like a heavy weight. From the center table, Mr. Harrison gently set down his wine glass and shook his head. "He's right," he murmured to his wife. "It's shameful, but he's right. We all let it happen." Lisa, at her table, leaned forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and introspection. "He's not just talking to the staff," she whispered. "He's talking to all of us." Giannis's voice grew stronger, imbued with a passionate sincerity. "The world we live in is already full of prejudice. We judge people by their clothes, by the color of their skin, by the way they speak, by what we assume they have or don't have. But a place like Elysian, a place like this, should be a sanctuary from that. This should be different. This is not just a place for the wealthy or the powerful. It is supposed to be a place where every single person feels valued and respected." He paused again, his gaze finding Clara, who was now standing near the kitchen entrance, a solitary figure engulfed in shame. He looked at her not with accusation, but with a gaze that seemed to offer a difficult path forward. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice softening slightly. "What truly matters is what we learn from them, how we choose to be better." Clara lowered her head further, his words a spotlight illuminating the depth of her failure. She knew there was no excuse, no justification for her actions. The weight of every eye in the room was a silent, crushing reminder of her responsibility. Giannis then turned his attention to the assembled staff, who stood frozen by the service stations. His tone remained firm, but his message was one of collective responsibility. "Elysian is not just a restaurant," he said. It's an idea. It's the idea that we can build connections not based on status or appearance, but on mutual respect and human kindness. If any of us forget that, then we fail. We don't just fail ourselves. We fail every customer who trusts us to be better. Several staff members bowed their heads, shame evident on their faces. Jake, who had silently witnessed the entire ordeal, nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting a newfound, profound respect for the man before him. Giannis's gaze then shifted back to the diners, and his voice rose, becoming a call to action. "And this is not just about the team here," he declared. "It's about all of us. We all have a responsibility to create a better, more compassionate world. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you have the right and, I believe, the obligation to speak up. Silence sometimes is complicity." His words rippled through the room, touching every heart. Some patrons bowed their heads, ashamed of their own inaction. Others looked at Giannis with a newfound, fervent admiration. Unable to contain herself, Lisa began to applaud, a soft, solitary sound. It was like a spark. Within seconds, another table joined in, then another, until the entire room was filled with a rolling, heartfelt ovation. Mr. Harrison was on his feet, clapping loudly, a broad, satisfied smile on his face. Giannis raised a hand, gently signaling for silence. He turned to Mr. Sterling, who stood nearby, his face a mixture of gratitude and deep concern. "I believe we can do better," Giannis said, his voice now calm but resolute. "I would like to meet with the entire team after we close tonight. It's time for a change." Mr. Sterling nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course, Mr. Antetokounmpo. I am so sorry for what happened tonight. We will make it right." Giannis sat back down and took a sip of water, as if the powerful, room-altering speech he had just delivered was nothing out of the ordinary. But it was clear that no one in that room would ever forget the lesson he had just taught them. In the corner, Clara felt the crushing weight of her shame, but beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of determination began to take root. She would change. She had to. Not for her job, but for herself. After the last diners had departed, Elysian sank into an unfamiliar silence. The staff gathered in the main dining room, forming a nervous circle. Giannis stood in the center, his presence calm, yet undeniably commanding. The light from the grand chandelier above cast long shadows, highlighting the seriousness and sincerity etched on his face. He surveyed the group, his eyes moving from Mr. Sterling to each server, busboy, and host, finally resting on Clara, who stood at the very edge of the circle, her head bowed, trying to make herself small. His voice was deep and firm, each word chosen with care. "Everyone makes mistakes," he began. "I have made many in my life, on the court and off. Mistakes do not define who we are. How we choose to correct them, that is what defines our character." He let the words hang in the air, allowing them to sink in. Several staff members nodded, understanding that his message was not just for Clara, but for every single person on the team. Giannis continued, his eyes sweeping the room. "This restaurant is not just a business to me. It is a promise. It is a promise that anyone who walks through these doors will be treated with the highest level of respect, not because of how much money they have, or how they are dressed, or who they are, but simply because they are a human being. Tonight, we broke that promise." Clara, standing at the edge of the circle, felt his words like a physical blow to her heart. Her eyes welled up, and she bit her lip, fighting a losing battle against the tears. She knew she couldn't hide forever. Giannis paused, and his gaze settled on her. There was no anger, no disdain, only a profound seriousness tempered with an unexpected kindness. "Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm, "tonight was a difficult night, not just for you, but for all of us. But I want to hear from you. What do you think we should do to make sure this never, ever happens again?" Clara looked up, her eyes red and swimming with tears. She took a ragged breath, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. I am so sorry, Mr. Antetokounmpo. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I let my own stupid prejudices and my pride blind me. I failed in my job, and I failed as a person. I truly, deeply regret it. She took another shuddering breath, the tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. I didn't understand, she choked out. I didn't understand that respect isn't something you earn by looking a certain way. I see that now, and I promise I will change. Giannis nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of empathy and encouragement. The change is for you, Clara, he said gently, not for me or for anyone else. Change is a journey, and I believe you can make that journey, if you truly want to. His words resonated with everyone in the room. Several staff members nodded, a silent admission that they, too, had room to grow, to rethink their own perspectives. Giannis took a step into the center of the circle, his voice dropping lower, becoming more intimate, more powerful. This restaurant is not defined by its crystal chandeliers or its expensive wine list, he said. It is defined by its people, by the way we treat each other, and the way we treat our guests. If we do not lead with respect and compassion, then nothing else matters. This beautiful room becomes an empty, meaningless shell. The room was utterly silent, the only sound the soft hum of the ventilation system. The staff stood captivated, not by a celebrity owner, but by a leader showing them a better way. From now on, Giannis declared, his voice rising with renewed purpose, our training will not just be about the menu and the wine. It will be about empathy. It will be about understanding. We will have workshops. We will talk about our own biases. We will learn to see the person, not the price tag. We will become the standard for what true hospitality means. He looked around the circle, meeting each person's eye. This is our new promise, he said, to our customers and to ourselves. We will be better. He then walked over to Clara. She flinched, expecting a final, formal dismissal. Instead, Giannis stopped in front of her and extended his enormous hand. We all have a long way to go, he said, his voice kind. Let's walk it together. Stunned, Clara looked from his outstretched hand to his face. Through her tears, she saw not a boss, not a celebrity, but a man of profound grace. Hesitantly, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. He gave it a firm, reassuring squeeze. In that simple gesture, there was no condemnation, only forgiveness and the promise of a second chance. The lesson of the night was complete. It wasn't about shame or punishment. It was about growth, compassion, and the quiet, powerful truth that the greatest strength lies in how we lift others up.